May 24, 1943, the Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin. Admiral Karl Dönitz rests his weight against a heavy oak desk, staring at the scattered telegrams beneath his hands. He has just received the final, broken Morse code transmission from U-954. A few frantic taps, and then eternal silence beneath the crushing depths of the North Atlantic. For 3 brutal years, his wolf packs had slaughtered thousands of American merchant ships. People walking the beaches of Florida and New Jersey could literally see the glow of burning tankers on the horizon. But a sudden, terrifying paradox has just slammed into the German high command. In just 3 short weeks this May, 41 of Germany's invincible U-boats have simply vanished. The ocean's most ruthless hunters are suddenly being hunted down and exterminated. Why? Dönitz didn't lose his fleet to a new class of giant dreadnoughts. His underwater empire was being dismantled by a vessel that German intelligence had openly mocked as a cheap toy, a strange, distinctly American creation that completely rewrote the rules of naval warfare. The moment Dönitz read the reports on this bizarre machine, he didn't just realize he had lost the Atlantic. He knew the Third Reich was already dead. Today, we are going to look right over his shoulder and read that report. To understand the sheer shock of that moment in May of 1943, you have to understand how Karl Dönitz viewed the world. He was not a man driven by blind rage or impulsive ideology. He was a tactician, an accountant of death. When he looked at the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, he did not see a battlefield of honor or knightly combat. He saw a simple problem of logistics. He called it the tonnage war. Dönitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping every single month, he would sever the arteries of the free world. Britain would slowly starve, running out of the grain, oil, and steel necessary to keep fighting. More importantly, the American war machine would be trapped on its own continent, physically unable to cross the ocean. If he hit that number, Germany won. It was a cold, statistical certainty, and for a long, terrifying stretch of time, his brutal arithmetic was entirely correct. When the United States entered the war in late 1941, the East Coast was completely unprepared for what was coming. The German submarine commanders called this period the Second Happy Time. They didn't even have to risk venturing into the deep, turbulent waters of the North Atlantic to hunt. They brought the war right to the American shoreline. In those early months, coastal cities like Miami, Atlantic City, and New York had not yet instituted mandatory blackouts. To the civilians on shore, the war still felt an ocean away. The neon signs of resort hotels and the bright street lamps along the boardwalks burned brightly every night. To a U-boat commander, this was a slaughterhouse bathed in perfect lighting. A German captain could sit his submarine in the pitch-black water, mere miles off the coast, and look through his periscope toward the shore. He didn't need radar. He didn't need complex firing solutions. He simply waited for the dark, lumbering silhouette of an American freighter to pass perfectly between his periscope and the glowing lights of a beachfront casino. They didn't even need to aim carefully. They just waited for the ships to sail past the lights and fired. Dönitz sat in his headquarters in Europe, watching his ledgers fill with staggering numbers. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and precious cargo sent straight to the bottom. To the German High Command, the United States appeared soft, slow, and tragically outmatched by the professional hunters of the Kriegsmarine. But Dönitz made one catastrophic miscalculation. He understood the carrying capacity of ships, the range of torpedoes, and the fuel consumption of a submarine. But his actuarial tables failed to account for who was actually steering those targeted vessels. The men dying in those burning waters off the American coast were not heavily armed battleship sailors. They were the men of the United States Merchant Marine, and they were about to prove that American resilience could not be quantified on a ledger. To truly grasp the magnitude of what the United States was up against in the Atlantic, you must first understand the men who were asked to absorb the most punishing blows of the German war machine. They were not elite commandos. They were not career naval officers. They were the United States Merchant Marine. These were entirely ordinary citizens. They were retired fishermen in their 50s, small-town bakers, auto mechanics, and young farm boys who had never seen the ocean before they enlisted. They wore civilian clothes. They sailed on slow, rusting, flat-bottomed freighters that possessed absolutely no heavy armor and in the early days of the war often lacked a single defensive deck gun to shoot back with. They were asked to do the impossible, to deliver the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, millions of tons of high-explosive artillery shells, aviation fuel, tanks, and food, across an ocean infested with the most lethal submarine force the world had ever seen. Imagine the reality of their daily existence. You are standing on the steel deck of a Liberty ship just off the coast of North Carolina. The waters around Cape Hatteras are so notoriously deadly that the sailors have given it a grim nickname. They call it Torpedo Junction. You are standing on top of 10,000 tons of highly volatile cargo. Your ship is moving at an agonizingly slow 10 knots, really the speed of a man riding a bicycle. The psychological toll of this journey is absolute torture. You know the U-boats are down there. You cannot see them. You cannot hear them. The enemy is entirely invisible, operating with impunity beneath the waves. The tension on board is suffocating. You are forbidden to strike a single match on deck at night. The discipline is absolute, because a U-boat commander looking through a Zeiss periscope can spot the momentary, tiny flare of a cigarette lighter from miles away in the pitch black. A single spark could instantly sign the death warrant for 40 men. You lie in your bunk at night, fully clothed, sometimes wearing your life preserver. You listen to the relentless, groaning creak of the ship's steel hull. You stare at the ceiling in the dark, and you cannot stop your mind from wondering if, at this exact second, a mechanized steel torpedo is rushing through the freezing water directly beneath your bed. The anticipation of death was a heavy physical weight, and when that death finally came, it was apocalyptic. When a torpedo struck a tanker carrying aviation fuel, the ship didn't just sink. It detonated. The ocean itself caught fire. Men were violently thrown from their bunks, or forced to jump blindly from the deck into freezing, oil-slicked waters that were literally burning on the surface. They plunged into the Atlantic in the dead of winter, hundreds of miles from the nearest shoreline. They clung to jagged pieces of wooden debris, choking on thick, black smoke, watching helplessly as their shipmates pulled away in shattered lifeboats that were already taking on water. And yet, Torpedo Junction was not the worst assignment a mariner could draw. Some of these men were ordered to sail the Murmansk Run. This was the treacherous convoy route taking desperate supplies up through the Arctic Circle to America's Soviet allies in Russia. Here the merchant sailors didn't just fight the German U-boats, and they didn't just fight the bombers of the Luftwaffe. They fought the Earth itself. They sailed through violent, towering Arctic storms. The sea spray would instantly freeze as it hit the ship, encasing the superstructure in tons of solid ice. The men had to go out onto the pitching, violently rolling decks with nothing but baseball bats and wooden mallets, desperately chipping the ice away so the ship wouldn't become top-heavy and capsize. If your ship was torpedoed in the Arctic Circle, there was no dramatic struggle for survival in the water. The temperature of the sea was so unimaginably cold that it would stop a man's heart and kill him in less than 3 minutes. The sheer brutality of this campaign produced a statistic that is both staggering and deeply sobering. 1 in 26. 1 out of every 26 mariners serving aboard American merchant ships in World War II died in the line of duty. Let that sink in. It was the highest proportional casualty rate of any service branch in the entire war. Higher than the Marines in the Pacific. Higher than the bomber crews over Europe. And it was suffered by civilian volunteers. Karl Dönitz, sitting in his headquarters in Berlin, looked at his logistical charts and saw these massive casualty numbers. His logic as a professional military officer dictated that this would be the breaking point. He firmly believed that once the American civilian sailors realized they were being sent to a watery grave, they would simply refuse to sail. He expected widespread strikes at the docks in New York and Boston. He expected the American supply lines to collapse from within out of sheer, undeniable terror. But his logic was completely shattered by the steel will of the American citizen. When a Liberty ship was blown out from under them, the men who survived the freezing, choking hell of the Atlantic were eventually pulled from the water. They were brought to shore, given a warm wool blanket, a hot cup of coffee, and perhaps a few days of rest. And then, almost to a man, they walked right back down to the hiring halls. They signed their names onto another slow, unarmed, floating bomb, and they went right back out to sea. They simply refused to be intimidated. They understood that if they did not sail, the soldiers fighting the tyranny of the Axis powers would have no bullets, no bandages, and no food. Thousands of these incredibly brave, ordinary Americans rest permanently beneath the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean today. They gave their lives in the most terrifying conditions imaginable, just to keep the lifeline of freedom open for the rest of the world. Because they were civilians, they never received the parades, the widespread glory, or the medals awarded to the military branches, and their immense sacrifice is too often left out of our history books. If you hold a deep, abiding respect for the quiet, unflinching courage of these men, please take a moment to like this video. It is a small, simple gesture, but it means the world to us. It helps push this history forward, ensuring that the staggering sacrifices of these unsung heroes are never forgotten by the generations that followed them. The American merchant marine held the line. They bought the United States the one resource it desperately needed: time. And back on the shores of America, the sleeping giant of industry was finally fully awake. A distinctly American solution was about to be unleashed on the Atlantic. A solution spearheaded not by a brilliant naval admiral, but by a man who built dams and poured concrete. While the men of the merchant marine were bleeding to keep the supply lines open, the Allied military command was staring at a massive, seemingly unsolvable geographic problem. If you were to look at a naval map of the Atlantic Ocean in the spring of 1942, the desperate reality of the situation became immediately clear. If you drew a circle around the eastern coastline of North America, that represented the absolute maximum range of American patrol bombers. If you drew a circle around the western coast of Great Britain, that represented the maximum flying range of the Royal Air Force. Between those two overlapping circles lay a vast, terrifying stretch of dark water. It was hundreds of thousands of square miles of open ocean where absolutely no land-based aircraft could reach. The Allied sailors called it the Black Pit. Karl Dönitz called it a sanctuary. His U-boat captains knew the geography just as well as the Allies did. They didn't even have to hunt for their prey. They simply sailed their submarines into the middle of the Black Pit, turned off their diesel engines, and waited. They knew that every single supply convoy heading from New York to Liverpool eventually had to cross through that deadly gap without any air cover whatsoever. The Allied militaries were paralyzed. You cannot build a land base on deep water. The traditional naval mindset dictated that the only way to provide air cover in the middle of the ocean was to use aircraft carriers. But the massive, fast, heavily armored fleet carriers, like the USS Enterprise or the Hornet, were desperately needed in the Pacific to fight the Imperial Japanese Navy. They simply could not be spared for escort duty in the Atlantic. Furthermore, the admirals in Washington and London believed that to fight a naval war, you needed purpose-built warships, and a fleet aircraft carrier took up to 3 years to build. The Allies did not have 3 years. They were losing the tonnage war right now. But America's greatest weapon in the Second World War was not forged in a military academy. It was forged in the civilian sector. Enter Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was not a naval architect. He possessed no military rank. He was a bulldog of a man, a heavy construction contractor who had built his reputation pouring concrete and moving mountains of dirt to build the Hoover Dam. He didn't care about centuries of rigid naval tradition. He cared about solving physical problems with raw labor, steel, and ruthless efficiency. When Kaiser looked at the U-boat crisis, he didn't see a complex military puzzle. He saw a simple supply chain bottleneck. The Navy said they desperately needed aircraft carriers, but fleet carriers took too long to build. Kaiser pointed at the standard mass-produced cargo ships. His commercial yards were already churning out, and asked a very pragmatic, deeply American question. What if we just cut the top off a freighter, weld a flat steel deck onto it, and call it a runway? The professional naval officers were absolutely appalled. The idea was a massive culture shock to the military establishment. These proposed escort carriers would be tiny, roughly a third of the size of a real fleet carrier. They wouldn't have the heavy, forged armor plating of a true warship. They would be incredibly slow, lumbering along at a top speed of maybe 18 knots. And their flight decks would be brutally short. making takeoffs and landings a terrifying prospect. The official military designation for these new ships was CVE, but the regular Navy personnel, looking at the initial blueprints with intense skepticism, joked that the letters stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Across the ocean, German intelligence received reports of these new American civilian projects and openly laughed. To Karl Dönitz and his highly trained aristocratic officer corps, these welded-together merchant hulls were a joke. They viewed them as a desperate, pathetic attempt by amateurs to play at naval warfare. A surfaced U-boat could practically outrun them. A single German torpedo would snap their unarmored spines in half. They dismissed them as cheap toys, but the German high command critically misunderstood what Henry Kaiser was actually building. He wasn't building invulnerable super weapons. He was building an assembly line. Kaiser brought civilian mass production techniques directly into naval warfare. He completely abandoned traditional riveting, which was slow and required highly specialized labor. He fully embraced welding, which was infinitely faster and easier to teach. In shipyards like the massive complex in Vancouver, Washington, something miraculous began to happen. The shipyards weren't filled with seasoned, lifelong naval shipwrights. They were filled with farmers from the Midwest, small-town mechanics, and shopkeepers. And crucially, they were filled with thousands of women, tying their hair back in heavy bandanas to pick up a welding torch for the first time in their lives. Women who had been sewing clothes or baking bread a month prior were now melting steel to build warships. This was the sheer, terrifying power of the American blue-collar worker. Kaiser utilized a revolutionary concept: modular construction. Deep inland, far away from the water, teams of workers would weld together entire, multi-story sections of a ship. They would construct an entire deckhouse, complete with plumbing and electrical wiring. Then, a massive crane would simply lift the entire multi-ton structure, carry it over to the slipway, and drop it directly onto the hull like a giant puzzle piece. The environment in these shipyards was an assault on the senses. It was deafening. The constant thundering roar of heavy machinery, the harsh, metallic smell of ozone from thousands of welding torches burning simultaneously, the freezing rain of the Pacific Northwest coming down on shifts that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under glaring arc lights. They weren't trying to build perfect artisan ships like the Germans did. Sometimes the welds were rough to the touch. Sometimes the bulkheads rattled when the engines pushed hard. But they weren't aiming for perfection. They were aiming for volume. They were trying to build enough ships to completely overwhelm the enemy. And they did. Kaiser's yards began churning out these ugly, slow, magnificent little aircraft carriers at a pace that defied human comprehension. At their peak, they were launching a brand new escort carrier every single week. They built 50 of the Casablanca-class carriers in just one single year. Karl Dönitz had spent his entire life optimizing the time it took to build a precision-engineered submarine. It took years of intense, rigorous academy training to produce a veteran U-boat commander. He was now facing a nation that could launch a fully functioning aircraft carrier faster than he could train a single torpedo man. The cold calculus of the tonnage war was suddenly flipping. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who builds warships the same way they build Ford pickup trucks on an assembly line. But a ship, no matter how fast it is built, is just a hollow shell of cold steel. It requires men to breathe life into it. And the men who were asked to fly heavy combat bombers off these combustible, vulnerable little decks were about to show the German Navy exactly what American resolve looked like. Because as these escort carriers finally sailed out of the shipyards and steered their blunt bows straight into the deadly waters of the Black Pit, the nature of the war fundamentally changed. The Americans were no longer going to huddle together like sheep, hoping the wolves wouldn't find them. The days of the Black Pit were over. The prey had just grown fangs. Up to this point in the war, the Allies had utilized a purely defensive strategy in the Atlantic. Convoys huddled together like frightened sheep, hoping the wolves simply wouldn't find them in the vastness of the ocean. But with the sudden influx of Kaiser's mass-produced escort carriers, the United States Navy fundamentally changed their doctrine. They were no longer going to wait to be attacked. They formed independent hunter-killer task forces. Their sole mission was to break away from the slow-moving convoys, aggressively roam the ocean, track down the U-boats, and destroy them before they ever saw a merchant ship. But how do you find a submarine in millions of square miles of empty water? Karl Dönitz believed his fleet was protected by an impenetrable shield of secrecy, the Enigma machine. The German High Command used this complex encryption device to constantly communicate with their U-boats, coordinating massive wolf-pack attacks. Dönitz was absolutely certain that the mathematical complexity of Enigma made it physically impossible to decipher. He routinely broadcasted his submarines' precise locations and rally points, supremely confident that the Allies heard nothing but static. He was wrong. In one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in human history, British and American codebreakers had shattered the Enigma cipher. The Allies were quietly reading Dönitz's mail. Armed with this top-secret intelligence, the American Navy didn't just route their fragile cargo convoys around the waiting wolf packs. They took the coordinates of the German submarines, handed them to the commanders of the new hunter-killer groups, and sent them straight into the teeth of the enemy. These groups were commanded by aggressive, fiercely determined men who understood that victory required ruthlessness. Men like Captain Daniel V. Gallery, commander of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Gallery was a pioneer of the hunter-killer concept. He pushed his men to the absolute limit of their physical endurance. His philosophy was simple. You do not just scare a U-boat away, you hunt it until it is destroyed. Gallery's relentless drive would eventually lead his task force to achieve the impossible, boarding and capturing a fully intact German submarine, the U-505, right on the high seas. But having a brilliant strategist and a ship means nothing without the men willing to execute the mission. And the task handed to the American pilots flying off these tiny carriers was nothing short of terrifying. To understand their reality, you must place yourself inside the cockpit of a Grumman TBF Avenger. It is a massive single-engine torpedo bomber. Fully loaded with depth charges, aviation fuel, and a crew of 3, it is incredibly heavy. It handles like a flying dump truck. Now imagine taking that heavy machine and trying to land it on a flight deck that is barely 500 feet long. A traditional fleet carrier is a massive, relatively stable platform. An escort carrier is essentially a hollow metal box bobbing like a cork in the open ocean. In the North Atlantic, the winter swells routinely reach 30 to 40 feet. You are a 22-year-old kid from Ohio, returning from a grueling 6-hour patrol over featureless grey water. Your fuel gauge is practically on zero. You are flying through freezing rain, looking for a ship that is pitching up and down like a seesaw. The deck drops 30 feet right as you make your final approach. Then it violently heaves back up, threatening to smash your landing gear straight up through your wings. If you miss the arresting wires, you do not have the speed to fly away. You hit the ocean, and the ship runs right over you. Doing this in broad daylight was a masterclass in aviation courage. Doing it in a North Atlantic gale bordered on the impossible. Yet these young Americans did it, day after day. Their quiet, relentless professionalism was the anvil upon which the German Navy was about to be broken. When these hunter-killer groups engaged the enemy, they executed a flawless, brutal ballet of destruction. The escort carrier did not fight alone. It sat at the center of a protective ring of destroyer escorts, highly maneuverable, heavily armed warships bristling with sonar and depth charges. But to truly appreciate the nightmare that was about to unfold, you have to look inside the steel hull of a Type VI U-boat. We often think of World War I U-boats as true submarines, much like the nuclear-powered vessels of today. They were not. They were essentially surface ships that only possessed the ability to submerge for short, desperate periods. Underwater, they relied entirely on electric batteries. Those batteries drained rapidly, and the air inside the claustrophobic hull quickly turned toxic as carbon dioxide built up. To survive, a U-boat had to surface every single night. The crew would throw open the hatches, desperately pulling in cold sea air, while the loud, smoking diesel engines roared to life to recharge the batteries. For years, the dark Atlantic night was their ultimate shield. A German commander could stand on the conning tower, the cold salt spray hitting his face, feeling completely secure. He was hundreds of miles from land, wrapped in total, suffocating darkness. He was untouchable. Then, everything changed. Out of the absolute pitch black of the sky, a searing, blinding searchlight snaps on. It is an American B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine Leviathan operating from distant shores, guided silently through the clouds by the glow of a radar screen. The Allies had perfected centimetric radar, shrinking the technology down so it could be carried by aircraft. The pilots didn't need to see the submarine with their eyes. Their radar picked up the metallic signature of the U-boat from miles away, guiding them silently through the night until they were directly overhead, caught in the glaring beam of a million's candle-power Lee light. The German lookouts barely have time to scream a warning before the aircraft drops its payload. If the U-boat managed to survive the initial bombing and execute a crash dive, their nightmare was only just beginning. Beneath the surface, the ocean was no longer a sanctuary. When an Avenger pilot from an escort carrier spotted a diving U-boat, he would drop a smoke marker on the water. That smoke was blood in the water for the American destroyer escorts. They would rush to the marker like a pack of snarling hounds. Inside the U-boat, the German crew would dive deep, sometimes over 600 feet, pushing the steel hull past its absolute breaking point. The commander would order silent running. The engines were cut. The men took off their shoes. They stopped talking. They lay in their bunks, sweating in the freezing dark, listening to the water rushing past the hull, praying they had slipped away. Then the silence is shattered. Ping. It is the cold, mechanical sound of American sonar striking their hull. Ping. It is getting closer. Then comes the deafening, concussive roar of depth charges. The ocean erupts. Inside the submarine, the shockwaves throw men to the deck. Glass dials shatter. The lights violently flicker and die, plunging the crew into absolute darkness. The thick steel hull groans and shrieks under the immense pressure of the ocean and the explosives. The air fills with the choking smell of chlorine gas from ruptured battery cells and the stench of terrified men. And even if they managed to maneuver away from the destroyers, the Americans had one final terrifying trick up their sleeve. It was called Fido, officially known as the Mark 24 mine. It was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It wasn't a mine at all. It was an air-dropped, acoustic homing torpedo. Dropped into the water by a circling Avenger, the torpedo would turn its acoustic sensors toward the sound of the U-boat's churning propellers. It ruthlessly tracked the submarine through the dark water. The German sonar operator would hear a high-pitched whine rapidly approaching from behind. There was no evasive maneuver. There was no defense against it. The torpedo would strike the stern, blowing off the propellers and rupturing the pressure hull, instantly flooding the ship. The hunters had officially become the hunted. The ocean, once the undisputed dominion of the Kriegsmarine, was now a steel cage with no exit. Part 5. Black May and the Legacy. The greatest arrogance of a military empire is not blindly believing its own weapons are invincible. It is fundamentally underestimating the endurance and the terrifying speed of correction of a free people when they are pushed to the wall. By the middle of May 1943, the reports flooding into Karl Dönitz's headquarters in Berlin were no longer just troubling. They were apocalyptic. May 6th. U-125, U-531, U-438, destroyed. May 12th. U-89, U-186, U-456, destroyed. May 19th. U-954 is sunk with all hands lost. Among the dead in the freezing water on U-954 was a young German watch officer named Peter Dönitz, the Admiral's own son. Yet even in his profound, devastating personal grief, Dönitz remained a man of cold logic. He stared at his actuarial tables, the operational charts and logistical ledgers that he had trusted for his entire career. The numbers had violently inverted. In that single month, which history would forever remember as Black May, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats. The Allies were suddenly sinking submarines faster than Germany could ever hope to build them. And conversely, Henry Kaiser's American shipyards were launching cargo ships and escort carriers faster than the remaining U-boats could ever hope to sink them. The hunter-killer groups were suffocating his fleet. The little, unarmored ships that his officers had so arrogantly laughed at were everywhere. American aircraft were swarming over the ocean like angry hornets, their radar piercing the protective veil of the night. On May 24, 1943, Karl Dönitz picked up his pen. He did not surrender his military, but he surrendered his entire strategy. He drafted an order to the U-boat fleet in the North Atlantic. He commanded them to break off the attack, to turn their rudders east, and to retreat. He ordered his wolves to abandon the hunting grounds. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote a stark, brutally honest assessment. He noted that the Allies had decisively won the battle of radar and air superiority. When he signed that retreat order, he knew the profound strategic implication of what had just happened. If the U-boats could not stop the American supply lines, then the full, terrifying weight of the American industrial machine was going to cross the ocean completely unchallenged. Millions of American boys, thousands of Sherman tanks, mountains of artillery shells, and rivers of aviation fuel were about to flood into Great Britain. Dönitz knew that once that stockpile reached critical mass, it would eventually be unleashed on the heavily fortified beaches of Western Europe. The fortress of Europe was going to be breached. The war was lost. It was now just a matter of time. The retreat of the U-boats from the North Atlantic in May of 1943 did not end the Second World War. There were still 2 long, incredibly bloody years of fighting ahead. There would be more torpedoes fired, more ships lost, and more brave men pulled into the freezing depths of the sea. But the strategic back of the German Navy was broken, and it would never recover. In the months that followed Black May, the Atlantic Ocean transformed. It went from being a chaotic slaughterhouse to becoming the greatest maritime logistics highway in human history. Convoy after convoy, stretching from horizon to horizon, steamed out of ports in New York, Boston, and Halifax. They sailed under the protective, watchful wings of aircraft launched from dozens of Henry Kaiser's little, welded-together escort carriers. They arrived in Britain entirely unmolested, offloading millions of tons of steel, fuel, and fighting men. Exactly 1 year and 13 days after Karl Dönitz signed that desperate retreat order, those same American boys, armed with those same American weapons, stepped off their landing craft into the surf of Normandy on D-Day. None of that would have been possible without the victory in the Atlantic. When we look back at military history, it is incredibly easy to get distracted by the imposing, terrifying weapons of war. The German U-boat was a marvel of lethal engineering. The German officer corps was perhaps the most rigorously trained military elite on the planet at that time. But wars of national survival are rarely decided by the sharpest sword. They are decided by the sheer resilience of the people wielding the shield. The little escort carriers, mocked as combustible and expendable toys, saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. They stand as the ultimate testament to the American spirit, finding a practical, blue-collar solution to an impossible problem and executing it with quiet, unflinching courage. And more than anyone else, this victory was forged by the civilian sailors of the United States Merchant Marine. Men who wore no uniforms and carried no guns, but possessed the iron will to stare down the U-boat threat day after agonizing day until the job was done. Many of you watching this video right now belong to a generation whose fathers, uncles, or grandfathers served during the Second World War. Maybe they sailed on one of those rust-streaked Liberty ships, carrying fuel through Torpedo Junction. Maybe they served on a destroyer escort, or worked the midnight shift in a shipyard welding bulkheads, or flew a heavy bomber off the violently pitching deck of a jeep carrier in a winter storm. The real history of this war, the absolute brutality of it, and the unimaginable quiet bravery it required, is not fully contained in government archives or thick academic history books. It is contained in the stories they told you around the dinner table when you were young. It lives in the quiet memories, the faded photographs, and the letters that belong exclusively to your families. Please do not let those priceless stories disappear with time. Take a moment right now and share your family's story in the comments below. Tell us your father's name. Tell us your grandfather's ship. Let us, and everyone watching this video across the country, read their names and remember exactly what they did. Their courage kept this world free. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next chapter of history.